This is the AuthKit website at authkit.com. It's quite common to see lighting effects on dark websites, and it's quite common for those lighting effects not to mean much. They're just there for visual interest. In this case, because they are introducing AuthKit, they've used the lighting effect as a spotlight to shine from the WorkOS logo down to the result of what this library will give you, which is these login forms. And so I quite like that because it does add visual interest, but it also means something a bit more significant because they're introducing something. And I find that quite a rare approach. The second thing is that even though these look like illustrations, they're actually interactive elements, so that they're showing you how the product works. And you might not realize that, you might not try to use them because you don't expect illustrative elements like this to be interactive. But one way they try to hint that to you without having to do a big arrow that says try me or something is that as you move your mouse around, these interactive elements follow the mouse. So they're sort of showing interest in your mouse position, which to me is quite a good, well, it's a subtle, but it's quite a good signifier of interactivity. And you can see here, if I click here and type, these work just like you'd expect them to if you were to implement this library yourself. And that's true of other interactive elements throughout. So you can see I move my mouse around, this doesn't move, these illustrative elements here, they're not interactive. But this one is, right? So they're sort of showing you the final result, and they're showing it so you can interact with it because that's an important part of the final result. Most of the rest of what I want to say is about the structure set up on the page. So they've got these, for example, these dots at the intersections of these lines. These remind me of rivets. You can also see them in the corner of the illustrative sort of forms. So they make me think of rivets or screws or other things that are used to hold things in place, and that suits the, it's quite on brand because it suits the construction element of developing your own software. You bring in this panel, you sort of bolt it into place. That's what you might imagine you would see in a real life panel that you'd bolt into place. So I quite like that because it's a way to highlight things, but it's also on brand because it relates to construction and building things. On top of that, you've got these guidelines, you've got these subtle crosses here, which maybe say, oh, don't use this space. You've got the dots again. And the subtle blue coloring along with that makes me think of blueprints. So they've, again, reinforced that idea of construction. In this case, it's a bit earlier in the process where you're planning things. So they've covered the sort of full process of planning to use and using AuthKit. So again, that's a nice on-brand touch. But they're not just there for illustration or for graphical purposes. They also help to guide the eye. They help to add more structure. And so you can see these lines here, they're guiding the eye down the page. These lines across here, they're outlining where the title goes. These lines here outlining where the subtitle goes, and so on. So they're sort of outlining the structure of the page a bit more, helping you to understand how that page is structured. And that's quite nice because it doesn't necessarily distract from the content, but it helps to reinforce it. You can see these sort of rivet marks or these dots are also sort of being used to highlight important content. So they're at the corners of this important content. So that's a nice touch. On top of that, the dots are a way to add structure to what are otherwise quite faint lines without adding too much visual weight. So you could, for example, do dotted lines across the ones, the sort of fainter lines that you think are important. You could pick these out in a brighter color, the ones that are important. But the way they've done it is they've just used a single dot in the intersections of the most important sort of structural lines, these ones surrounding the actual content. And so I just like mechanically that's a way to do that, to highlight the important parts without using too much visual weight, because you might imagine someone would fill this line with a brighter color or fill the background of the sort of module here with a different color. So this is a nice subtle way to do it, quite effective, because you're not taking up any more space. You're not drawing too much attention to the structure. That's good. There's one thing I've noticed that they use either this sort of line and dot structure or this sort of glassy container. If I scroll down here, you can see, for example, here's the line and dots surrounding, and then here's a glassy container, and that contains some more things. Again, down here, here's some glassy containers. They don't have the dots and the lines here. But notice that they are using these sort of subtle lines throughout the site as a kind of a motif, so that they're keeping that up. They're making it all feel more coherent. But yeah, again, glassy containers here. Down here again, you've got the lines and the dots in the background essentially, and then these glassy containers in the foreground. And so what I like about that is that essentially they've got these two levels of structure they can add. So they could be using glassy containers everywhere, they could be using dots and lines everywhere, but instead they've set up these two levels, these hierarchical levels, where in the background for a more subtle structure, they're using the lines and the dots, and then in the foreground for more emphasized structure, they're using the glassy containers. That's quite a nice foreground background effect, so that you can communicate even more importance with the content for the stuff that's really important, like the demonstration of the product or like the calls to action. Because you can imagine this could all just be dots and lines, and then you might not have these here at all, these glassy containers. You might just have the content inside it sitting on the background, but this elevates it that much more. One thing I like about the, where are they? Yeah, up here, the illustrative elements that are not interactive. They put a lot of effort into these sort of quite faint background elements. They've drawn what look like circuitry components and they've put these in. These both make the whole thing more interesting to look at, but they also represent the brand again really well, because it's representing what's going on behind the scenes. And when we think of behind the scenes with computers, we often think of the actual components inside the computer. They've represented that well. So up here, they're talking about what you see when you're using it, the foreground. And here they've got this sort of background sense of here's what's going on behind the scenes. And they represent that relatively intuitively, where you understand this is what the computer's doing because it looks like a computer. So they put a lot of effort into making these, I'm sure, and they're not just there for visual interest, they're also there to reinforce the concept and to help you understand what you're looking at immediately. One last thing before I finish is that I found it interesting that these testimonials are the one case where there's only lines and dots used, as far as I know, and not glass containers. So it feels like the rest of the website, you can see that for the primary content, they're using the glassy containers, and then the lines and dots are only used for background. And so I don't think they break that rule, apart from in this case, where unlike everywhere else, they're only using lines and dots. They didn't go for glassy containers first. My best guess about that is because it's so close to and supportive of these final calls to action, they decided to treat this like an extension of this sort of secondary background structure, and just use the background structure, the lines and dots, so that you see it essentially as these testimonials support your decision to potentially click on these final calls to action, which I think is quite nice because they are quite close. There's no divider between them. They sort of then end up feeling like they're grouped together, even though there's enough space so that these don't feel crowded.